billions burned while the Galactic Council debated. They begged us for fleets, for armadas, for a tidal wave of steel to push back the encroaching dark. We didn't send an armada. Humanity sent one ship, just one, and the alien coalition thought it was an insult, a cruel joke played by an uncaring species. They didn't understand what was inside that heavily scarred hull. They didn't smell the ozone, the stale sweat, the sheer spite. By the time they realized, the war was already over. Bile tasted like battery acid and copper. Wyatt spat a thick glob of it into the stainless steel basin, gripping the edges so hard his knuckles popped. The cryo-thaw was never clean. It felt like being dragged backward through a meat grinder while drowning in freezing gel. He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that echoed in the cramped revival bay, and wiped his mouth with the back of a trembling, pale hand. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. One of the bulbs was dying, flickering a sickly yellow against the bulkheads. The air in the room smelled like rubbing alcohol and old socks, the distinct aroma of recycled oxygen that had been breathed by too many terrified people for too many months. "Heart rate is stabilizing, Captain," a voice muttered from the gloom. "Briggs." Wyatt didn't look up right away. He focused on the vibration humming through the deck plates beneath his bare feet. It was a rough, uneven thrum. The Goliath wasn't a sleek vessel. She was an old asteroid cracker, retrofitted with armor plating so thick she flew like a pregnant cow. "Tell me we aren't late, Briggs," Wyatt rasped, finally straightening up. His joints popped like dry twigs. He grabbed a grey towel from a rack and scrubbed the remaining cryogenic slime from his neck and chest. The skin there was covered in faint silvery scars, shrapnel from the Jovian riots a decade ago. "We're 10 minutes from the jump point exit," Briggs said, stepping into the flickering light. He handed Wyatt a mug of something dark and steaming. It wasn't coffee. It was engine room chicory, thick as sludge and bitter enough to strip paint. "The coalition beacon is still active, but it's weak." Wyatt took the mug. The ceramic was chipped, rough against his lip. The heat radiated into his cold palms, a small comfort in the freezing expanse of the ship. He took a sip, grimaced, and swallowed. "Casualties? Massive," Briggs replied, his voice dead flat. He wasn't looking at Wyatt. He was staring at the deck. "The intercept arrays picked up the telemetry while we were thawing. The enemy, they call them the Vant. They tore through the 7th Fleet at Aegis Prime. The coalition is falling back to the inner system. They're getting butchered, Wyatt, slaughtered." Wyatt set the mug down on the basin. A heavy stone dropped in his gut. Not fear exactly, more like a profound, exhausting dread. He wanted to be back on Earth. He wanted to be sitting on his porch in Montana, smelling wet pine and listening to the wind. Instead, he was standing naked in a metal box, billions of miles from sunlight, sent to bail out a bunch of aliens who had looked down their snouts at humanity until the day their skies caught fire. "Get my boots," Wyatt said. 10 minutes later, he stepped onto the bridge. There was no grand doorway, no sweeping vista of the cosmos. The bridge of the Goliath was buried deep in the center of the ship, wrapped in 30 meters of titanium and depleted uranium. It was a cramped, claustrophobic bunker, packed with greasy consoles, tangled cabling, and the sharp stink of hot electronics. Hayes sat at the comm station, her leg bouncing nervously, the heel of her boot tapping a frantic, irregular rhythm against the floor plating. Dawson was at the helm, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack molars. "Talk to me," Wyatt ordered, dropping into the command chair. The seat cushion was worn flat, smelling faintly of stale sweat and cheap synthetic leather. "Dropping out of slip space in 40 seconds, Dawson said, his hands moving over the manual thruster controls. "Inertial dampeners are at 80%. Gonna be a rough stop. We've got a tight beam from the coalition flagship, the Radiant Dawn," Hayes chimed in. Her voice cracked a little. She cleared her throat and tried again. "They are demanding to know the status of the human armada." Wyatt rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble scraping against his palm. "Armada? Right, tell them we're it." Hayes turned her chair, her eyes wide. "Captain? Just us?" "You heard me, Hayes. Send the designation. USS Goliath, single ship." Wyatt leaned forward, staring at the main tactical monitor. It was currently a static hiss of dead space. He didn't feel like a savior. He felt like a fool. The United Nations Earth Command had debated for months. Politicians argued about resource allocation, about planetary defense, about the risks of drawing the Vant's attention. In the end, a compromise. They wouldn't send a fleet. They wouldn't leave Earth defenseless. They would send the Goliath, packed with something the aliens didn't understand, something humanity had perfected over centuries of butchering each other, unadulterated, blunt force kinetic violence. 10 seconds, Dawson called out. Wyatt gripped the armrests. Brace! The ship shuddered violently. A horrific groaning sound echoed through the bulkheads, like a submarine diving too deep. Wyatt's teeth rattled in his skull. The artificial gravity hitched, dropping his stomach into his boots, and then slammed back with bruising force. The main monitor snapped from static to reality. Wyatt stopped breathing. Aegis Prime wasn't a planet anymore. It was a graveyard. Space was littered with burning metal. Thousands of twisted, glowing husks drifted against the backdrop of a dull red sun. The Coalition ships had been beautiful once. Wyatt had seen the hollows, sweeping, elegant curves, shimmering energy sails, pearlescent hulls. Now they were gutted fish, spilling frozen atmosphere and flash-frozen bodies into the void. Amidst the wreckage, the Vant ships moved. They were utterly devoid of aesthetics. Brutal, jagged, obsidian wedges that absorbed the starlight. They didn't fly, they hunted. Energy beams, silent and blindingly white, lashed out from the black wedges, carving through the remaining Coalition frigates like scalpels through warm wax. Jesus Christ, Dawson whispered. The helm console reflected in his terrified eyes. Comms are blowing up, Hayes shouted over the rising wail of the proximity alarms. The bridge was bathed in pulsing red light. The radiant dawn is hailing us, audio and visual. They're frantic. Put it through, Wyatt said. He forced his shoulders to drop, forced his breathing to slow. Panic was a contagion. If he caught it, the bridge crew would die of it. The side monitor flickered. The alien commander appeared. Wyatt didn't know the species' name. It didn't matter. It looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a starved greyhound, wrapped in a uniform that was currently stained with thick violet fluid. The creature was trembling, its mandibles clicking rapidly, the translation matrix struggling to keep up with its panicked screeches. "Human vessel, where is the rest of your fleet? Where is the Armada?" The synthesized voice from the translator was painfully loud, clipping the speakers. "We are taking critical damage. Our shields are failing. Give us your deployment coordinates for the fleet." Wyatt stared at the alien. He saw the genuine, unadulterated terror in its black, multifaceted eyes. A part of him, a dark, cynical part, felt a flicker of resentment. For decades, these beings had treated humanity like apes playing with fire. Now they were begging the apes to save them. "This is Captain Wyatt of the USS Goliath," Wyatt said, his voice low, a gravelly rumble cutting through the bridge's chaos. "There is no fleet. You're looking at the deployment." The alien froze. For a second, the bridge was utterly silent, except for the hum of the air scrubbers. "One ship?" the translator spat. The alien slammed a long, segmented fist against its own console. Violet blood smeared across the lens. "You sent one primitive mining barge to a slaughter? This is an insult, a betrayal. You have doomed us all. We are dead. The galaxy is burning, and humanity spits in our faces." The feed cut out abruptly. Hayes looked back at Wyatt, her face pale. "They cut the connection, Captain. They're redirecting power to their engines, trying to break the blockade and run." "They won't make it," Briggs said quietly from the tactical station. "The Vant cruisers are flanking them. They'll be trapped in the gravity well." Wyatt felt a headache blooming behind his eyes. He rubbed his temples, pushing hard enough to hurt. The alien was right. It was an insult. One ship against 300 Vant wedges. It was suicide. He closed his eyes for a split second. He thought of the deep, black water of the Pacific. He thought of the way cold rain felt on his face. He didn't want to die here, choking on recycled air, ripped apart by silent black ships. He was terrified. His stomach was a tight knot of raw, acidic fear. He wanted to order Dawson to turn the ship around, jump back to Earth, and let the galaxy burn. But he opened his eyes. He looked at Hayes, at Dawson, at Briggs. They were looking at him, waiting. "Dawson," Wyatt said, his voice eerily calm, "put us right down the throat of the largest Vant cluster. Dead ahead." Dawson swallowed hard, but his hands didn't shake. "Aye, Captain. Bringing engines to full burn." "Briggs," Wyatt turned to his XO. "Drop the blast shutters. Seal the bulkheads. Spin up the magnetic accelerators. All of them." "Spun up and holding," Briggs replied. his fingers flying over the armaments board. "Railgun capacitors are at maximum charge. Hayes, open a wideband broadcast. Unencrypted," Wyatt ordered. "To the coalition?" Hayes asked. "No, to the Vant." Wyatt stood up. He walked over to the center console, the deck vibrating fiercely beneath him as the Goliath's massive, dirty fusion drives kicked into overdrive. "Broadcast is live," Hayes said. Wyatt leaned into the microphone. He didn't have a grand speech. He didn't have a poetic declaration of war. He just had the grinding, ugly reality of human engineering. "This is the Goliath," Wyatt snarled. "Get the hell out of our way." He nodded to Hayes. She cut the feed. "Target lock?" Wyatt asked. "Locked on the lead dreadnought," Briggs said. The targeting reticle on the main screen hovered over a massive obsidian shard that was currently tearing a coalition cruiser in half. The aliens fought with light, plasma, lasers, directed energy. It was clean. It cauterized as it cut. Humanity didn't fight with light. "Fire the main battery," Wyatt ordered. The noise was indescribable. When the Goliath fired its spinal-mounted magnetic accelerator cannons, it wasn't a zap or a hum, it was a physical blow. The entire ship violently jerked backward, throwing Wyatt against the command console. The scream of tearing metal and super-stressed alloys tore through the bridge, so loud it bypassed the ears and rattled the teeth in his jaw. The smell of burning insulation and raw, vaporized copper instantly flooded the room. On the monitor, there was no glowing beam. There was only the consequence. 3 slugs of solid, depleted uranium, each the size of a city bus, accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light. They crossed the distance between the Goliath and the Vant dreadnought in the time it took Wyatt to blink. The Vant relied on displacement shields to deflect energy weapons. Kinetic impactors didn't care about displacement. The uranium slugs hit the obsidian wedge dead center. The kinetic transfer was apocalyptic. The Vant dreadnought didn't explode. It shattered. The sheer kinetic force crumpled the impenetrable black armor like wet tissue paper, driving through the vessel from bow to stern and blowing the entire rear half of the ship out into space in a silent, blossoming cloud of jagged shrapnel. The shockwave in the bridge was palpable. Cheers didn't erupt. It was too brutal for cheers. "Target destroyed," Briggs coughed, waving away a plume of acrid smoke rising from a blown fuse on his console. "Recoil stabilizers blew out on Deck 4. We have minor atmospheric venting in Section G. Seal Section G. Reroute power to the autoloaders," Wyatt barked, wiping a trickle of blood from his nose. The sudden deceleration had ruptured capillaries. He smeared it across the back of his hand. "Dawson, keep us moving. If we stay still, we die." The Goliath plunged into the heart of the wreckage, a filthy, scarred brawler charging into a room of snipers. The Vant fleet reacted. They stopped firing on the fleeing coalition remnants and turned their sleek, featureless bows toward the human ship. The tactical map lit up with hundreds of targeting lasers, painting the Goliath in a web of invisible hostility. "Incoming plasma lances! Multiple signatures!" Briggs yelled, his voice tight. "Brace!" Wyatt shouted. The impacts hit them like the hammers of God. The Goliath rolled violently to port. The lights on the bridge shattered, plunging them into darkness, lit only by the sparking consoles and the strobing red emergency floods. The heat was instantaneous, a suffocating, dry wave that sucked the moisture from Wyatt's eyes. "Ablative armor on the port side is holding, but it's melting fast," Dawson screamed over the din of screaming metal. "We just lost maneuvering thrusters 3 and 4. "Roll us!" Wyatt ordered, grabbing the railing of the command console to keep from being thrown to the deck. "Present the ventral plating! Briggs, give me flak! Fill the sky with it! Firing point defense!" Along the hull of the Goliath, hundreds of mechanical turrets spun up. They didn't fire lasers. They fired millions of jagged tungsten bearings, creating an impenetrable cloud of high-velocity metal around the ship. The silent, blinding plasma beams of the Vant struck the flak cloud, superheating the tungsten, but losing cohesion before they could melt through the ship's primary armor. "We're in the middle of them," Hayes reported, coughing hard as smoke thickened in the air. "Good," Wyatt grinned. It was an ugly, desperate expression. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was terrified, but beneath the terror was a cold, vicious clarity. "Let's show them how a bar fight works. Broadside batteries fire at will. Target anything painted black." The Goliath erupted. Missiles, unguided rockets, explosive autocannon rounds, a chaotic, messy torrent of primitive, explosive rage tore into the pristine Vant formation. Ships that were designed to gracefully dance around laser fire were suddenly being sandblasted by high-explosive shrapnel. Two Vant interceptors, attempting to strafe the Goliath, were caught in a barrage of 120mm explosive rounds. Their shields flickered and died under the kinetic barrage, and their hulls were shredded into expanding clouds of debris. A heavy impact slammed into the starboard side. Wyatt lost his grip and hit the deck hard, his shoulder exploding in pain. He gritted his teeth, tasting blood, and dragged himself back up. "Breach on deck 7, Briggs yelled, frantic. "Sealing doors! We've got massive heat spikes in the reactor core. Captain, we can't take this pounding for long. They're trying to swarm us." Through the main monitor, the Vant ships were circling, tightening the noose. The Goliath was a bleeding beast surrounded by wolves. "They want to get close," Wyatt spat, gripping his injured shoulder. The bridge was a sauna of sweat, blood, and burning wiring. "Dawson, kill the forward thrusters. Let them close in." "Captain?" Dawson looked back, horrified. "Do it. Briggs, prep the nuclear ordnance. Tube 1 and 2. Briggs hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes widening. "Close-range detonation? It'll strip our own armor. It'll strip theirs worse," Wyatt snapped. "Do it." The Goliath slowed, drifting dead in the water. The Vant ships, sensing weakness, tightened their formation, moving in for the killing blow. The tactical map showed them swarming like black locusts. Wyatt watched the proximity meters tick down. 50 kilometers, 30, 10. He could see the intricate, shifting patterns on the hulls of the Vant ships now. "Now, Briggs, fire!" Two heavy torpedoes, dull grey and unassuming, slid out of the Goliath's forward tubes. They didn't travel far. They barely cleared the ship's own magnetic field. Then two suns ignited in the dark. Radiation klaxons did not wail. They screamed. It was a high, serrated pitch that drilled directly into the inner ear, impossible to tune out. Wyatt peeled his face off the deck plating. The impact of the twin nuclear detonations had thrown him completely over the command console, slamming his jaw against the reinforced bulkhead. His mouth tasted heavily of rust and old pennies. Blood dripped from his chin, pooling on the grated floor in thick, dark drops. Everything in his peripheral vision was washed out in a stark, blinding white. A residual ghost from the unshielded flash that had leaked through the viewports before the polarization filters snapped shut. Heat radiated from the walls. The air inside the bridge felt thick, oppressive, like breathing inside an active oven. The distinct, nauseating odor of melted plastics and vaporized coolant coated the back of his throat. "Damage report," Wyatt barked. His voice sounded distant, muffled by the ringing in his ears. He grabbed the edge of a chair and hauled himself upright. His left knee screamed in protest, a sharp, grinding pain that made his vision swim. He ignored it. The bridge was a disaster zone. Emergency strobes painted the smoke-filled room in chaotic bursts of crimson. Sparks rained down from shattered overhead conduits, raining like miniature, angry stars upon the crew. "Primary optical sensors are fried," Briggs rasped. He was slumped over the tactical console, holding a blood-soaked rag to his forehead. A nasty gash ran along his hairline, courtesy of a flying piece of shattered monitor housing. "Camera feeds are totally blind. I've got nothing but passive sonar and magnetic anomaly detectors. The electromagnetic pulse stripped the outer sensor layer right off the hull." "Engines?" Wyatt asked, limping heavily toward the helm. Dawson was still strapped into the pilot's chair, but his head hung at an unnatural angle. Wyatt's heart stalled in his chest. He reached out, his hand trembling, and grabbed Dawson's shoulder. The helmsman groaned, a wet, rattling sound, and slowly lifted his head. His face was pale, slick with cold sweat, but his eyes were open, wide, and frantic. "I'm here, Captain," Dawson choked out, spitting a mouthful of saliva and blood onto his control panel. Engines are barely holding. Reactor 3 automatically scrammed due to a localized thermal spike. We've lost 30% of our thrust. Maneuvering thrusters on the starboard quarter are slagged. We are drifting." Wyatt gripped Dawson's shoulder a fraction tighter, a silent, desperate grounding. "You're doing fine, kid. Hold her steady. Keep the nose pointed into the drift." He turned back to the center of the room. The main monitor was dead, a cracked slab of black glass. "Hayes," Wyatt called out. "Talk to me. Tell me we didn't just nuke ourselves for nothing." Hayes was frantically typing on a backup terminal, her face illuminated by the harsh green glow of the archaic screen. Her hands shook violently. She paused, pressed a sequence of keys, and stared at the readout. "Proximity alerts are gone, Captain," she whispered. She looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and terror. "The swarm! It's gone!" "Define gone," Briggs demanded, pressing the rag harder against his bleeding skull. "The detonation caught them in a tight formation," Hayes explained, her voice gaining a fraction of its normal strength. "Vant displacement shields are designed for directional energy absorption. They couldn't handle omnidirectional, high-yield thermonuclear shockwaves at point-blank range. The radiation and sheer kinetic wall of the blasts turned their vanguard into dust. We evaporated 63 hostiles." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the bridge, broken only by the hiss of a ruptured atmospheric pipe and the dying crackle of a ruined console. 63 ships, wiped out in a fraction of a second. It was butchery on a cosmic scale. Wyatt didn't feel victorious. He felt sick, his stomach churned with the battery acid bile again. He had just detonated 2 gigaton-yield weapons practically in his own lap. The sheer suicidal insanity of the maneuver weighed heavily on his chest. It was a tactic born of desperation, not genius. It was the desperate thrashing of a cornered animal. "Hull integrity?" Wyatt asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. "It's bad, sir," Briggs replied, pulling up her ship-wide schematic on a secondary screen. Sections of the Goliath blinked in angry, pulsing red. "We lost the entire ablative outer layer on the bow. The inner titanium A plating took structural damage. We have microfractures along the port-side bulkheads. Decks 3, 4, and 7 are sealed due to localized decompression. Casualties?" Briggs hesitated, his jaw working. "Give it to me, Briggs." "Medical is reporting heavy trauma in the forward gunnery batteries. The shockwave scrambled the loaders. 12 dead, 30 severely wounded." Wyatt closed his eyes. The names flashed in his mind. Miller, O'Connor, Henderson, people he had shared bad coffee and worse jokes with in the mess hall, people who had trusted him to bring them back to Earth. The knot of dread in his gut tightened, twisting into a sharp, agonizing spike of guilt. He opened his eyes. He couldn't afford grief right now. Grief got people killed. "Get medical teams to the forward batteries," Wyatt ordered, his tone flat, emotionless. "Reroute life support to stabilize the wounded sections. Have damage control teams patch those microfractures before the internal pressure blows them wide open." "Captain," Hayes interrupted, her finger pressing against her earpiece. "I'm picking up a signal. It's bleeding through the background radiation of the blasts. The Coalition?" "No," Hayes swallowed hard. "It's the Vant." The blood drained completely from Wyatt's face. "Put it on the speakers." Static filled the bridge. It was heavy, rhythmic static, like the grinding of massive tectonic plates. Beneath the static, there was a sound. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't language. It was a low, mechanical screech, a digital shriek that vibrated in the fillings of Wyatt's teeth. It sounded like metal tearing metal, a sound utterly devoid of anything biological or empathetic. It was the sound of cold, calculated fury. "They're regrouping," Briggs said, pointing to his green-tinted tactical screen. "The surviving ships from the vanguard. They aren't retreating. They're falling back and merging with the main fleet. And Captain, the main fleet is massive." Wyatt limped over to Briggs's console. The passive sensors were slowly painting a picture of the battlefield. Beyond the lingering radioactive clouds of the nuclear blasts, a dense, terrifying wall of black wedges was forming. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They hadn't broken the Vant, they had merely annoyed them. "They adapted," Dawson whispered from the helm, staring at his own readouts. "They're spreading out, a loose, spherical formation. They know we use area of effect weapons now. They won't bunch up again." Wyatt stared at the green blips on the screen. The reality of the situation crashed down on him like a physical weight. The Goliath was crippled. They had used their trump card, and it hadn't been enough. They were bleeding, half-blind, and drifting in a graveyard of alien ships. "Hayes," Wyatt said quietly, "are we still receiving the Coalition beacon?" Faintly, Hayes replied. The Radiant Dawn and a handful of frigates managed to put some distance between themselves and the combat zone, while we drew the Vant's attention. But their engines are heavily damaged. They're limping toward the jump point. Wyatt looked around his ruined bridge. He looked at Briggs' bleeding head. He looked at Dawson's terrified, exhausted face. He felt the sluggish, uneven vibration of the crippled fusion drives through the deck plates. "Plot an intercept course for the Radiant Dawn," Wyatt ordered. "Captain," Briggs asked, surprised. "If we move toward them, we drag the Vant swarm right to their doorstep. We'll doom them." "They're already doomed, Briggs," Wyatt snapped, a sudden, fierce anger flaring in his chest. "We all are. If we stay here, we get picked apart from a distance by plasma lances. If we run, they hunt us down. Our only chance is to link up with the Coalition flagship, tether our drives, and use our combined mass to punch through the jump point before the Vant can surround us." It was a terrible plan. It relied on a damaged alien ship coordinating with a severely damaged human vessel, while under fire from an overwhelming enemy force. It was a coin toss where both sides of the coin were smeared with blood. "Dawson, get those drives online," Wyatt growled. "I don't care if you have to bypass the safeties and run the core hot enough to melt the containment vessel. Give me thrust." Dawson nodded, his hands flying across the console, his pain momentarily forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. "Bypassing limiters. Core temperature is spiking. Thrust in 3, 2, 1. The Goliath shuddered violently. A horrific, groaning protest echoed from the engine room, a sound like a dying beast, but the deck plates vibrated with renewed intensity. The ship lurched forward, dragging its massive, battered bulk through the void. "We are moving," Dawson called out, a desperate edge to his voice. "Vector locked on the Radiant Dawn. ETA is 12 minutes. Hayes, get me the alien commander," Wyatt said, gripping the command chair. "We need to tell them we're coming in hot." Static hissed over the comms, a harsh, grating sound that chewed at Wyatt's fraying nerves. The connection was garbage. The nuclear detonations had saturated the local space with electromagnetic interference, turning standard communication frequencies into a garbled mess of white noise. "Try bouncing the signal off the nearest debris field," Wyatt suggested, rubbing the aching bridge of his nose. He smelled burnt hair. He realized it was his own. Hayes furiously typed commands, her knuckles white. "Rerouting through the wreckage of a Coalition dreadnought, pushing through. I have a handshake. Audio only. The video feed is too corrupted. Put him on." The static cleared slightly, replaced by the rapid, frantic clicking of the alien commander's mandibles, filtered through the translation matrix. "Human vessel, Goliath, You are still functioning?" The synthesized voice held a distinct undertone of absolute disbelief. "Barely," Wyatt grunted, leaning heavily against the comms console. His knee was throbbing, a deep, rhythmic pain that matched the failing beat of the ship's engines. "We bought you some time. I hope you used it." "You detonated atomic weaponry," the alien commander stated. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "Unshielded, primitive fission-fusion devices. The radiation wave caused catastrophic interference with our remaining navigation matrices. You possess weapons of indiscriminate planetary destruction on a single warship?" Wyatt let out a dry, hacking laugh that tasted of copper. "Yeah, we do. And they just saved your spindly ass. Now shut up and listen. We are coming to your coordinates. Our outer armor is gone, and we're leaking atmosphere. But our core drives possess enough raw kinetic output to push both our ships into the jump point." Silence stretched over the comms, heavy and thick. "You intend to tether?" The alien sounded horrified. "Our hull architecture is elegant. It is not designed to withstand the crude magnetic clamping of a human mining vessel. You will crush our superstructure." Wyatt slammed his fist onto the console. The metal dented slightly under his knuckles. "Listen to me, you arrogant bastard. Look at your tactical plot. The Vant are swarming. They adapt faster than you can blink. If you sit there worrying about the paint job on your elegant ship, you are going to die. We tether. We burn hard for the jump point, or we become floating scrap. Choose." The silence returned. Wyatt could almost hear the frantic debates happening on the bridge of the Radiant Dawn. He pictured the sleek, pearl-white aliens, stained with violet blood, arguing about the indignity of being rescued by humans. He didn't care about their dignity. He cared about the 300 human lives currently bleeding and suffocating on the lower decks of the Goliath. "Approaching human vessel," the alien commander finally responded, the synthesized voice stiff and formal. "We are adjusting our vector to match your trajectory. Prepare your clamps. May the ancestors forgive us for this indignity." "Tell your ancestors they're welcome," Wyatt muttered, cutting the channel. "Target acquired," Briggs announced, pointing to the fuzzy green outline on the passive sonar display. "The Radiant Dawn is 400 kilometers out and closing, but Captain, look behind them." Wyatt squinted at the screen. Behind the massive, shimmering silhouette of the Coalition flagship, a swarm of tiny, rapidly moving dots was emerging from the background static. "Vant interceptors," Dawson said, his voice tight. "They bypassed our position. They're going straight for the Coalition remnants." The Vant didn't care about revenge. They didn't care about the Goliath blowing up their vanguard. They were cold, algorithmic killers. They saw the fleeing, damaged Coalition ships as the softer target, the easier prey. "Time to intercept?" Wyatt demanded. 3 minutes, Briggs replied. "They'll be in plasma lance range before we can reach the tethering distance." Wyatt stared at the screen. The Radiant Dawn was huge, a massive city of glass and energy sails. It was beautiful, but it was fragile. If the Vant interceptors got within range, they would carve it to pieces before the Goliath could even lock on. "We need to draw them off," Wyatt said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "Captain, we don't have the maneuverability," Dawson protested, turning in his chair. "We are flying a brick. If we turn to engage those interceptors, we lose our momentum toward the flagship." "We don't turn," Wyatt said, his voice dropping into a cold, dead calm. It was the voice he used when he had to make a choice between two terrible options. "We just make ourselves the biggest, loudest target in the sky." He looked at Briggs. Briggs met his gaze, his face pale beneath the smeared blood. He knew what Wyatt was thinking. "Briggs, drop the reactor shielding," Hayes gasped. Dawson froze. "Captain," Briggs said slowly, carefully, "if we drop the magnetic containment shielding on the fusion core, we will bleed gamma radiation into space like a dying star. We'll blind every sensor in the sector, but the internal shielding will hold for exactly 4 minutes before the crew on decks 8 through 10 start cooking," Wyatt finished for him. "I know the specs, Briggs." "It's suicide," Hayes whispered. "It's a flare," Wyatt corrected, his voice hardening. "The Vant track energy signatures. We drop the shielding. Our thermal and radioactive output will spike so hard, it'll look like a supernova on their scopes. Their algorithmic targeting will classify us as a critical, localized threat. They'll break off the Radiant Dawn and come for us." "And then?" Dawson asked, his hands trembling on the helm controls. "And then we pray the Radiant Dawn clamps onto us before the interceptors melt our engines into slag," Wyatt said. He didn't look at his crew. He couldn't. "Do it, Briggs." Briggs didn't argue. He turned back to his console, his fingers moving with grim mechanical precision. "Disengaging magnetic containment limiters, venting thermal baffles, core shielding dropping in 3, 2, 1. Deep within the bowels of the Goliath, a terrible, resonant hum began. It was a sound felt in the marrow of the bones rather than heard. The deck plates beneath Wyatt's boots grew instantly, uncomfortably warm. On the tactical display, the Goliath's icon transformed from a dim green dot into a blinding, expanding red halo. "Radiation spikes across the board," Hayes reported, her voice shaking violently. "Internal dosimeters on the engineering decks are climbing fast." "Hold them off, engineering," Wyatt muttered under his breath. "Just give me 4 minutes." He stared at the display. The swarm of Vant interceptors, previously locked onto the Radiant Dawn, suddenly shifted. It was a terrifyingly synchronized movement, like a school of predatory fish reacting to a drop of blood in the water. The tiny dots altered their vectors, banking sharply away from the alien flagship and turning their sleek, featureless bows directly toward the Goliath. "They took the bait," Briggs said, wiping sweat from his eyes. The bridge was rapidly turning into an oven. "Dawson, max thrust. Put us right in the path of the Radiant Dawn." Wyatt ordered, gripping the railing as a wave of dizziness washed over him. The heat was becoming unbearable. "Incoming fire!" Briggs shouted. Silent, brilliant streaks of white plasma slashed through the dark. The Vant interceptors were firing from extreme range. The Goliath shuddered as a beam grazed the port side, vaporizing a section of the already ruined outer hull. A secondary explosion rocked the ship, throwing Hayes out of her chair. "Hull breach in Section F!" Briggs yelled over the alarms. "We are losing atmosphere! Seal it! Keep pushing!" Wyatt roared. Through the cracked forward viewports, a massive shadow blotted out the distant starlight. The radiant dawn was directly ahead, its pearlescent hull scarred and blackened by plasma burns. It was massive, easily 10 times the size of the Goliath. "Distance to target, 2 kilometers, Dawson called out, his voice cracking. 1 kilometer. We are in their shadow. Briggs, fire the harpoons. Now!" From the dorsal and ventral plating of the Goliath, 4 massive, explosive-driven tungsten spikes shot outward, trailing thick cords of braided carbon nanotube cabling. The spikes slammed into the reinforced underbelly of the alien flagship. The kinetic impact reverberated through the Goliath. "Contact!" Briggs yelled. "Clamps engaged. Winches are pulling taut." "Human vessel! What are you doing? Your radiation output is frying our external sensors!" The alien commander's voice bled over the comms, panicked and furious. "We're saving your life!" Wyatt screamed back, hitting the broadcast switch. "Dawson, cut the main drive! Let them drag us! Briggs, restore the reactor shielding! Now, damn it, now!" The horrific, vibrating hum suddenly ceased, replaced by the chaotic sounds of straining metal. The carbon cables pulled tight, shrieking in protest as the massive inertia of the Goliath fought against the fleeing momentum of the radiant dawn. For a terrifying second, Wyatt thought the cables would snap, or that they would rip the underbelly right off the alien ship. The Goliath groaned, its internal structure screaming under the localized stress, but the cables held. The Goliath violently swung into the slipstream of the radiant dawn, dragged along like a battered tin can tied to the bumper of a speeding car. "Shielding is back up," Briggs gasped, collapsing back into his chair. "Radiation levels are dropping, but engineering took a massive dose." Wyatt swallowed hard, refusing to look at the casualty reports that were surely flashing on Briggs's screen. "The interceptors? They're falling behind," Hayes reported, dragging herself back into her seat. "They slowed down when our energy signature vanished. The radiant dawn is entering the jump point parameters." Outside the viewports, the fabric of space began to distort, bending and twisting into a chaotic swirl of violet and blue light. The familiar, nauseating sensation of slipspace transition washed over the bridge. The Goliath slammed into the jump point, tethered to the bleeding alien flagship, leaving the burning graveyard of Aegis Prime behind them. They had survived. But as Wyatt tasted the blood in his mouth and felt the crushing heat of the bridge, he knew the galaxy had just seen how humans fought, and he knew with a sickening certainty that the Vant would not underestimate them a second time. Slipspace wasn't a tunnel of swirling lights, no matter what the recruitment hollows showed. It was just a profound, absolute nothingness that made the eyes ache and the stomach churn. Inside the bridge of the Goliath, the silence was far worse than the noise of the battle had been. Without the deep, rhythmic thrum of the main fusion drives, the ship felt like a tomb. The only sounds were the intermittent, dying sparks from Hayes's shattered comms console and the horrifying, metallic groan of the 4 carbon nanotube tow cables straining against the hull. The radiant dawn was dragging them through the dimensional tear, and every shift in velocity translated into a violent, localized earthquake in the Goliath's superstructure. Wyatt sat heavily in the command chair. The adrenaline crash was hitting him like a physical blow. The intense, suffocating heat of the unshielded reactor had rapidly dissipated once the shielding was restored, replaced by the biting cold of failing environmental controls. His sweat, previously pouring down his face, now felt like a layer of frost against his skin. He shivered, tasting dried blood and the unmistakable acrid flavor of copper on his tongue. The air smelled of burnt insulation, ozone, and the sour tang of nervous vomit. "Briggs," Wyatt croaked. His throat felt full of sand. "Give me the butcher's bill." Briggs didn't turn around immediately. He was leaning on his console, his head bowed, the bloody rag still pressed against his temple. The flickering emergency strobes cast long, dancing shadows across his hunched back. When he finally looked up, his face was the color of old parchment. "It's bad, Captain," Briggs said quietly. He tapped a few keys, and a crude green-tinted table appeared on the only surviving secondary monitor. USS Goliath, preliminary damage and casualty. Report. Wyatt stared at the numbers. 52 people were critically injured or dead. 52 lives extinguished or permanently altered because he ordered the shielding dropped. He felt a sickening twist in his gut, a heavy stone of guilt dragging him down. He had traded his own crew to save an alien flagship that had mocked them hours earlier. "Engineering?" Wyatt asked, dreading the answer. "The radiation dose? Lethal for most of the primary watch," Briggs replied, his voice cracking. Chief O'Reilly manually locked down the venting baffles when the automated systems melted. He took the brunt of the gamma burst. Medical says he has hours, maybe less. They've pumped him full of iodine and painkillers, but his cellular structure is falling apart. Wyatt squeezed his eyes shut. He remembered O'Reilly, a loud, booming Irishman with a thick red beard who brewed awful moonshine in the hydroponics bay. A man who had a daughter in university back in Chicago. Now he was melting from the inside out in a sterile cot because Wyatt had used his ship as a decoy. "Captain," Hayes interrupted softly. She was shivering violently, her uniform jacket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "The Radiant Dawn is hailing us via a hard line through the tether cables. Their commander wants to speak." "Put him on," Wyatt said, opening his eyes and forcing his face into a mask of cold indifference. The audio crackled through the bridge speakers, surprisingly clear compared to the static-filled broad wave from earlier. "Human vessel," the alien commander's translated voice echoed. It lacked the frantic edge of the battle, replaced by a weary, formal tone. "This is Fleet Commander Zal. We are currently stabilizing our slipspace vector. We project arrival at the Coalition rally point in approximately 4 standard hours." "Understood, Zal. This is Captain Wyatt," he replied, leaning toward the microphone. "What's your structural integrity? Are those cables going to tear the bottom out of your ship?" "Our lower bulkheads are straining but holding," Zal responded. A brief pause followed, heavy with unspoken tension. "Captain Wyatt, I must acknowledge the tactical reality of what occurred. Your vessel willingly exposed itself to lethal energy levels to divert the swarm. Our sensors recorded the internal radiation spike within your hull. You irradiated your own engineering cast." "They aren't a cast," Wyatt snapped, a sudden, fierce flash of anger cutting through his exhaustion. "They're my crew. And yes, we did, because if we hadn't, you'd be floating scrap and we'd be right next to you." "It was a barbaric maneuver, utterly lacking in preservation logic," Zal said. The translation matrix struggled slightly with the alien's inflection, but the mix of horror and grudging respect was obvious. "Yet it was effective. We owe you our survival. The Coalition will be informed of humanity's sacrifice." "Save the speeches, Commander," Wyatt muttered, rubbing his throbbing knee. The pain was settling deep into the joint, a sharp, grinding agony with every pulse of his heart. "Just get us to the rally point and have your medical teams ready. We have dozens of severe radiation casualties. Our med bay is running out of anti-rad meds and synthetic blood." "Understood. We will prepare our triage centers for your biology." Zal out. The connection severed. Wyatt let out a long, ragged breath. He looked around the ruined bridge. Dawson was slumped in the helm chair, fast asleep from pure neurological exhaustion, his broken nose casting a dark shadow over his face. Hayes was weeping silently at her station, her hands trembling as she tried to reroute power to the primary life support. They had survived the fire, but they were still burning. "Briggs," Wyatt said, standing up. His knee buckled, and he caught himself heavily on the command console. "Take the con. I'm going down to medical." "Captain, you're injured," Briggs protested, looking at the dark blood staining Wyatt's uniform pants. "I'm fine," Wyatt lied. The contradiction was bitter on his tongue. He was falling apart, physically and mentally, but he couldn't show it. "Not yet. Keep us tethered. If those cables start to snap, you initiate emergency explosive detachment. We do not take the Radiant Dawn down with us if we break apart. Understood?" "Yes, sir." Wyatt limped toward the heavy blast doors at the rear of the bridge. The metal was cold to the touch. He keyed the manual release, and the door ground open with a screech of warped tracks. He stepped out into the dark, freezing corridor of Deck 1. The smell of ozone and death wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. The transition out of slipspace was violent. The Goliath, lacking its own active inertial dampeners, was subjected to the full brutal whiplash of real space deceleration. Wyatt, sitting by a cot in the overcrowded medical bay, was thrown against a bulkhead. He hit his bad shoulder, grunting as fresh pain flared through his collarbone. Around him, the wounded cried out. The medical bay was a nightmare of dim emergency lighting and the smell of raw, burnt meat. Synthetic blood bags hung from makeshift IV poles taped to the ceiling overhead. "We've stopped, Chief Medical Officer Vance." "Wait, no, Dr. Aris," shouted over the groans. Aris was covered in blood up to her elbows, her surgical mask stained pink. "Gravity plating is stabilizing." Wyatt pushed himself off the deck, his breathing heavy. His comms earpiece chimed. "Captain," Briggs's voice came through, thick with static. "We are in real space. We made it to the rally point." "Status?" Wyatt asked, limping toward the medbay exit. "You need to see this, sir. I'm routing a visual from a surviving secondary camera to your datapad." Wyatt pulled his datapad from his belt. The screen flickered, struggling with the localized interference, then resolved into a grainy, low-resolution image. They were floating in the outer edge of a massive, dense nebula. The gas clouds were a bruised, violent mix of deep purples and sickly greens, providing heavy sensor cover against the Vant. But it wasn't the nebula that made Wyatt stop walking. It was the boneyard. Hundreds of coalition ships drifted in the gas cloud. They were massive, elegant vessels, built for a clean, civilized war. But they were all broken. Shimmering energy sails were torn into ragged strips. Pearlescent hulls were scorched black, marred by massive, gaping craters, where Vant kinetic weapons and plasma lances had ripped through their displacement shields. It was a fleet of ghosts, limping in the dark, bleeding atmosphere and coolant into the vibrant gas of the nebula. The Goliath looked absurd among them. It was a squat, ugly block of scarred grey metal, dragging behind the radiant dawn on heavy tethers like a rusty anchor. It possessed none of the sweeping curves or biological aesthetics of the alien ships. It was a flying cinder block covered in gun barrels. "The Radiant Dawn has released the tethers," Briggs reported over the comms. "We are drifting free. Zal is broadcasting our arrival to the surviving Fleet Command. Sir, they're sending a boarding shuttle. Fleet Commander Zal has requested your presence on the flagship for an immediate war council." Wyatt stared at the datapad. He was exhausted. He was bleeding from a gash on his chin. His knee was swollen to the size of a grapefruit, and his uniform smelled like an open grave. He had just watched O'Reilly slip into a coma from massive cellular degradation. The absolute last thing he wanted to do was sit in a sterile alien boardroom and talk politics. "Tell them no," Wyatt rasped. "Captain, they are sending medical supplies on that shuttle. High-grade radio protectants and cellular regenerators," Briggs urged gently. "They want the commander of the human vessel present. It's a matter of alliance protocol." Wyatt closed his eyes. The internal contradiction tore at him. He hated these aliens. He hated their arrogance, their clean, bloodless approach to a universe that was inherently violent. But he needed their medicine to save his crew. He swallowed his pride, a bitter, jagged pill. "Fine," Wyatt spat. "Tell them to dock at airlock 3. It's the only one not warped shut." 20 minutes later, Wyatt stood in the cramped, freezing staging area of Airlock 3. He hadn't changed uniforms. There were no clean ones left anyway. He had simply wiped the worst of the blood off his face with a wet rag. His combat boots were scuffed and stained, his jacket torn at the shoulder. He had issued a set of standing orders before leaving the bridge. Priority 1, patch the hull micro-fractures in Section G. Priority 2, keep the reactor running at minimal output to power life support. Priority 3, if the aliens try anything suspicious, vent the remaining nuclear arsenal directly into their docking bay. The airlock cycled with a heavy pneumatic hiss. The heavy steel doors ground open, revealing the interior of the Coalition shuttle. The contrast was immediate and jarring. The air pouring out of the shuttle was warm and smelled faintly of lavender and ozone. The interior was pristine white, illuminated by soft, ambient light that cast no shadows. 2 alien guards stood at the entrance. They were tall, slender beings, clad in ceremonial armor that looked more like sculpted glass than actual plating. They held sleek, silent energy rifles. They looked at Wyatt, and Wyatt looked back. He knew exactly what they saw. They saw a brute, a primitive, dirty ape wrapped in stained cloth and heavy, primitive metal. They saw a creature that solved problems by throwing rocks at the speed of light and detonating dirty bombs in its own face. One of the guards clicked its mandibles, a sound of unmistakable disgust, and gestured for Wyatt to enter. Wyatt stepped into the shuttle. His heavy, steel-toed boots clanked loudly against the pristine, soft-touch decking. He deliberately didn't wipe his boots. He left a trail of dirty, irradiated Goliath grease on their immaculate floor. The flight to the radiant dawn was silent. Wyatt refused to sit in the contoured, biologically incompatible seating. He stood holding a ceiling rail, his bad knee throbbing with a dull, persistent rhythm. When the shuttle docked with the flagship, Wyatt walked out into a massive, sweeping hangar bay. It was the size of a football stadium, vaulted and clean, but currently filled with the frantic, organized chaos of triage. Alien medics darted between rows of wounded soldiers. Fleet Commander Zal was waiting for him. The alien commander was taller than Wyatt by 2 feet, its long, mantis-like limbs wrapped in a shimmering, violet-trimmed uniform. "Captain Wyatt," Zal said, the translator matrix hanging around its thin neck buzzing. "Welcome aboard the Radiant Dawn. Your medical supplies are currently being transferred to your airlock." "Keep them coming," Wyatt grunted, crossing his arms. He felt a sharp pain in his ribs, but ignored it. "My people are dying. We have convened the surviving Admiralty," Zal continued, its large, multifaceted black eyes staring down at Wyatt's blood-stained collar. "They are eager to hear from the human who broke the Vanguard with unshielded atomic fire." "I didn't break them, I pissed them off," Wyatt corrected bluntly. He didn't care about their delicate sensibilities. "They adapted in 2 minutes. If we don't figure out a way to crack their algorithmic swarming, this whole fleet is going to be dead by the end of the week." Zal's mandibles twitched. It was a gesture Wyatt was quickly learning to associate with anxiety. "The Council awaits your perspective," Zal said, turning and gesturing down a sweeping, illuminated corridor. "They believe humanity possesses a unique tactical doctrine." "We don't have a doctrine," Wyatt said, limping heavily as he followed the towering alien. The smell of his own stale sweat mixed unpleasantly with the lavender air of the corridor. "We have spite. We have the sheer, stubborn refusal to die quietly. If you want to win this war, you're going to have to stop fighting like artists." Wyatt stopped, forcing Zal to turn back and look at him. Wyatt's eyes were cold, raw, and utterly human. "You're going to have to learn how to fight like butchers." Glass and arrogance formed the sweeping amphitheater of the council chamber. No corners existed here, only organic curves illuminated by a harsh, shadowless white light that made Wyatt's retinas burn. He stood in the sunken center of the room. High above him, perched on floating crystalline tiers, sat the surviving Admiralty of the Coalition. They looked down at him, an assembly of slender, mantis-like forms wrapped in pristine silks and polished ceramic armor. They smelled of ozone and crushed lilies. Wyatt smelled of dried sweat, coagulated blood, and reactor coolant. He shifted his weight, his steel-toed boot scraping loudly against the floorless floor. The sound echoed, ugly and abrupt, interrupting the hushed, clicking murmurs of the council. "You propose we abandon defensive formations," an elder admiral stated. Its translator box emitted a voice that sounded like grinding crystal. "You ask us to scatter into the corrosive dust clouds of the nebula and engage in unstructured, chaotic skirmishes. This violates 6 centuries of tactical doctrine." Wyatt rubbed his jaw. The stubble was coarse, scraping against his palm. "Your doctrine is dead. Look out the window. The Vant do not care about your formations. They are an algorithm. Algorithms solve math problems. When you fly in elegant, predictable patterns, you are just feeding them a math problem they already know how to solve." Zal stood beside the elder. "And what does humanity feed them, Captain?" "Noise," Wyatt said. He pointed a scarred finger at the holographic projection of the nebula hovering in the center of the room. "You fight with light and logic. The Vant adapt to it, but they could not adapt to a pair of unshielded nuclear warheads blowing up in their faces. It made zero logical sense to detonate them at 0 range. You want to beat them? You have to stop playing chess. You have to flip the table." He limped around the hologram. His knee throbbed, a hot, stabbing pain that radiated up his thigh. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to keep moving. This nebula, Wyatt gestured to the purple gas clouds. It is packed with ionized heavy metals. It scrambles sensors. Your ships are hiding in it, crying in the dark. But we can use it. The Goliath is a flying chunk of dense, irradiated metal. We strip our dampeners. We fly blind into the densest pockets of the gas. The Vant sensors will struggle to lock on. When they get close enough to see us visually, we do not shoot them with lasers. We hit them with physical mass. We drag asteroids into their flight paths. We use explosive shrapnel to shred their intakes. The elder admiral clicked its mandibles furiously, a sound like dry twigs snapping. You reduce war to a tavern brawl. War is a tavern brawl, Wyatt snarled, his voice rising, bouncing off the glass walls. You just dressed it up in silk and called it art. My crew is dying right now because we had to act like bait to save your flagship. I am not throwing away any more human lives so you can maintain your dignity. We fight dirty or we die clean. Pick one. Silence stretched across the amphitheater. The shadowless light felt suddenly colder. Wyatt stood in the center, a bruised, bleeding ape among angels, waiting for them to descend into the mud. Zal finally stepped forward, looking down at the projection. We have heavy mining charges, plasma core detonators used for cracking planetary crusts. They lack the elegance of our ship weapons. Load them on to the Goliath, Wyatt said, a grim, humorless smile touching his cracked lips. We will show you exactly how to use them. Returning to the Goliath felt suffocating. Wyatt sat heavily on the pristine shuttle bench, staring blankly at the floor. He had won the argument. The coalition was giving him their heavy munitions and a blank check to run the Vanguard distraction, but the victory tasted like ash. They were going back into the meat grinder. When the airlock cycled open, the smell hit him like a physical blow. It was the scent of a dying ship. The air scrubbers were failing, leaving the corridors reeking of electrical fires and spilled copper. The emergency lights cast long, bloody shadows against the reinforced bulkheads. Briggs was waiting for him in the staging area. The executive officer looked hollowed out. The bloody rag was gone from his head, replaced by a sloppy white bandage that was already seeping red. "Report!" Wyatt grunted, stepping out of the airlock. His knee nearly gave out, but he caught himself on the doorframe. "The alien medical supplies helped," Briggs said, his voice a flat, dead monotone. "We stabilized 20 of the burn victims. The radio protectants are working, but it was not enough for the engineering crew." Wyatt stopped walking. He stared at the steel grating beneath his boots. "O'Reilly?" "Gone," Briggs whispered. "His heart gave out 10 minutes ago. Cellular degradation was too extensive. We lost 6 others with him. Medical Bay is stacking the bodies in the portside cold storage. We do not have the power to run the incinerators." A heavy, terrible weight settled over Wyatt's chest. He could not breathe. He leaned his forehead against the cold metal wall of the corridor, closing his eyes. The metal was freezing, sapping the heat from his skin. He pictured O'Reilly laughing in the hydroponics bay, pouring terrible moonshine into plastic cups. Now he was a corpse in a freezer. "He locked the baffles," Wyatt said quietly to the wall. "He saved the ship, Captain," Briggs replied. Wyatt turned his head, looking at his XO. "He saved an alien flagship that called us primitive, and now we are going back out there to do it again." "The coalition gave us the charges?" Briggs asked. "Yeah, they are loading them onto the cargo bays now. Ugly, heavy plasma crackers." Wyatt pushed himself off the wall. The sorrow in his gut was rapidly metastasizing into a cold, focused rage. "Dawson patched the engines?" "Barely. We have 60% thrust. The steering is going to be sluggish." "It does not matter," Wyatt said, limping toward the bridge elevator. "We are not dogfighting. We are going into the thickest part of the nebula and dropping those plasma charges like breadcrumbs. When the Vant swarm comes in to investigate, we blow the gas clouds. We turn the entire sector into a microwave." Briggs nodded slowly. "It is a suicide run, sir. Only if we stay to watch the fireworks," Wyatt muttered, hitting the elevator call button with a bruised knuckle. "Get down to the cargo bay. Supervise the loading of those charges. I want them wired into our manual launch tubes." "Yes, sir." Briggs turned to leave, but paused. "Captain, the crew..." They are scared. We took a massive beating. Morale is bleeding out faster than the oxygen. Wyatt looked at the scarred steel doors of the elevator. He knew they were scared. He was terrified. Every instinct screamed at him to fire up the slip-space drive and run back to Earth. But Earth could not hide from the Vant. Nobody could. "I will talk to them," Wyatt said. He entered the elevator. The doors ground shut, sealing him inside the tiny metal box. The elevator car shuddered violently as it ascended. The metal grated against the warp tracks, emitting a high-pitched squeal that dug into his eardrums. He stared at his bruised reflection in the scratched steel, wondering how many more of these rides he had left before the end. He rode up to the bridge in silence, listening to the agonizing creaks of the Goliath's battered hull. When he stepped onto the bridge, Dawson and Hayes were at their stations. They looked up, their eyes sunken and dark. The bridge was a graveyard of shattered glass and sparking wires. Wyatt walked to the center console. He did not sit down. He leaned heavily against the console, gripping the edges until his knuckles turned white. He keyed the ship-wide intercom. "This is the captain," Wyatt said, his gravelly voice echoing through the bleeding, broken corridors of the Goliath. "I know you are tired. I know you are hurting. We lost good people today. People who deserved better than dying in the dark for a galaxy that does not care about us." He paused, listening to the sluggish thrum of the patched engines. "The Coalition wants to hide. They want to rely on their math and their perfect formations. Let them. We are not artists. We are a sledgehammer. The Vant think they figured us out. They think we are broken. In 10 minutes, we are taking this ship into the nebula. We are going to load their airspace with enough high-yield explosives to crack a moon, and we are going to detonate it all at once." Wyatt looked at Dawson. The helmsman was sitting up straighter, his hands resting on the manual thruster controls. Hayes was wiping her eyes, her jaw clenched tight. "We fight dirty," Wyatt snarled into the intercom, the pure spite bleeding into his words. "We fight ugly. We make them bleed for every inch of space they take. We are the Goliath. Now, patch your suits, load the guns, and let us go kill some algorithms." He cut the feed. The bridge was silent for a moment. Then Dawson slammed his fist against the helm console. "Engines are spooled, Captain. Awaiting your vector." Wyatt allowed a tiny, vicious grin to touch his face. "Take us into the dark, Dawson. Let us make some noise. If you felt the recoil rattling in your chest and tasted the copper and ozone in the air, hit that like button. We poured our blood and sweat into bringing the gritty, desperate reality of the USS Goliath to life. This is just the beginning of humanity's brutal stand against the dark. Don't miss out on the rest of the slaughter. Subscribe to the channel, ring that notification bell, and share this video with your fellow sci-fi junkies. Drop a comment below. What would your first order be on the bridge? Stay frosty, Space Marines.